Well, welcome to our third class on, I call it Listen to What the Spirit Says, because that's the phrase we're going to see once we get into the letters themselves, looking primarily at the first three chapters of Revelation. In our first lesson, we looked at chapter 1, which introduced several topics that I felt could use some exploring. We saw letters were going to be sent to congregations. We saw that these Christians that are being sent to lived in Roman Asia, and we saw that there were seven cities, congregations in seven cities, who had received the letters. Of those three, we looked at the second one last week. We looked at Roman Asia. And this lesson, my plan is to look at letters and correspondence in the first century. And then next week, I plan to look at the seven cities these were sent to in a fairly general way. And I see people are starting to come in now. So I always think when that happens, I should have started a bit earlier. But this is what I want to look at in our time together this evening. I want to look at writing and travel amongst the ancient peoples. I want to look at the transmission of letters in the first century, and then zero in a bit on Christian letters and their transmission. And hopefully they'll give us maybe a bit of insight into several things in the New Testament, because over half the New Testament basically is made up of letters. So hopefully it'll give us some insight into some of those things. Writing and travel were mutually dependent. Without the one, there could not have been the other. And if you think about it, there'd be no point in writing and sending a letter if no one was traveling to that area. So communication by letter was one way to share thoughts and information to people in different locations. Now, there was no postal service as we have. Now, I grew up in a time where letter writing was common, and sometimes letter writing was vital. When I was almost 8, my family moved to Finland. Now, this photo here was taken as we're about to sail home from Oslo, Norway. I'm the one as you're looking at it, on the left of the photo. But to communicate with family back home, the primary way we did it when we were in Finland was through the post. International phone calls in the late 1960s, they existed, but they were extremely expensive. That was a rare treat. Instead, we relied on written letters and cards and making tape recordings and posting them. Now, I still have many of those recordings, and it's good to hear how we sounded and what we were talking about at that time. In that photograph, my dad's got our reel-to-reel stereo in his hand because he carried that with him on board the ship. But letter writing was vital to be able to keep in touch with family and for my parents to keep in touch with their supporters. Now, when I moved to Scotland in the mid 80s, letters and recordings are a lot of what we relied on to communicate with my family. In 1985, we're still a few years away from having computers and the internet. Smartphones and tablets were still part of science fiction. Now, international phone calls by this time were cheaper. It was about £1 a minute to phone home. And so we didn't do it very often. And most calls were at the birth of our children. We usually spoke with home about once a month, but very short conversations. That was my son's first day of school. But when they were growing up, that's what we had to rely on. Of course, then came modern technology. Doesn't look very modern today, does it? But computer usage led to affordable internet. If you remember, our internet initially was dial-up, and we had email, and that was such an advance. My older brother and I had the first access to email in my family, and he had me send a note to my dad when dad was about to visit him on email, and he showed it to dad, got dad to reply to, explained how it worked, and he sent me a note that I replied back. And Dad was so fascinated that we could communicate that quickly. And Dad was then sold on email as the way to correspond much faster. Letters, even then, were taking 5 to 7 days each way. So if you wrote a letter, you could get a response back in about 2 weeks. And of course, then came Skype, where we could talk without fees, and text messages, and smartphones, and FaceTime, and now WhatsApp and Zoom. And we're all over the place as we meet together here. But in the first century, almost 2,000 years ago, none of that existed, and neither did they even have a postal service. Now, it's thought that the development of letter writing, the development of writing, took place fairly early. That's present, and then from the time people began to write, it seems like they were writing letters, sometimes very official things, but they were writing them. In the mid to late 1800s, it was thought that letter writing was a relatively recent development in human history. But what we've discovered is that writing has been in existence since remote times and used in daily life and administration. Early writing was on clay tablets, which were baked and became a permanent record. Here, this is a photo of what's called the Armana letters from 14th century Egypt. They're in the British Museum. But by the time of the Greeks, this seems to have been reserved, the baking them, for decrees and other state documents, when these could have been engraved and placed in public places, and more than one copy could have been created. Most personal and literary documents would have been written on perishable materials. Papyrus and vellum, animal skins, were the paper of the day. Most of these have not survived due to the dampness of climate. The place we find these preserved from ancient times are in dry areas like Egypt and Israel. Egypt perfected the paper of the day, which was papyrus. They developed that 400 years before Jesus' birth. Papyrus is referred to by Herodotus in Greek as an ordinary use in the 5th century BC, although we don't know exactly when it began to be used. Before the development of papyrus, the skins of animals were used. They were worked, and we have vellum as a result. But because of what they were written on, most of these haven't survived. And the photo you're seeing there is about 200 AD from Egypt. It's a manuscript of the oldest surviving almost complete copy of Paul's letters. But you see, it has survived, but it was in Egypt that it survived, even though it's on papyrus. William Ramsay wrote, "Those that were written on papyrus and things have been lost because the material on which they were written could not last. If we accept the correspondence of Cicero, the great importance of which caused it to be preserved, hardly any ancient letters not intended for publication by their writers have come down to us except in Egypt, where the original paper has, in a number of cases, survived." Now, we know that both travel and writing began in ancient times, even though most of the correspondence has not been preserved. What has been preserved in dry climates testify to how correspondence, though, was used. And this brings us to what's going on in the first century Roman world. The desire to communicate through letters would not feel important if you didn't know whether the one you were writing to would ever receive it. So when we arrive in the Roman world, it became easier and safer to send letters than at any time previous to this. Two main reasons. Number one, Rome built a vast system of roads connecting various towns and cities. That's depicted here on this map that I found on Wikipedia. And so you can see the vast network of roads throughout the Roman Empire. This even includes those that they built over here in Britain, although it just barely gets into Scotland. But they didn't go very far into Scotland. But so that was it. They had this road system, a good road system, and there were messengers that were employed by trading companies as well as the government who are constantly traveling to deliver letters and other messages to their agents or officials in the various Roman provinces. But the thing was, there was no general postal service. There have been various types of courier services established throughout history. In fact, Cyrus the Great established something called CHAPAR, Khapur, KHANEH, Khapur Kana, or something like that, which was a state-run courier service. But it was used as the royal method of communication. Darius the Great developed it further. When Augustus became Caesar, he established a courier and transportation service based on Cyrus's service. He called it cursus publicus. Although that might sound like it was a public postal service, publicus after all, it was actually the royal method of communication. This illustration here I found on Wikipedia as well, and it is the illustration of the cursus publicus. And I think you're supposed to put all these together and have one great big long one. And there's a couple more folios to it. But I think the actual route that the Postal Service went is the one that runs in the middle of most of those depictions there. I found this article by Mark Cartwright on worldhistory.org. And he said, Augustus is credited by Suetonius with creating the Roman postal system, perhaps more accurately described as a communication system, so that he could better govern his vast empire. The system first used couriers who went all the way from sender to receiver and then later relays of them. The messengers were offered rations and fresh transport at regular stations along the 120,000 kilometers, 75,000 miles of road network, which allowed messages to travel some 80 kilometers a day, 50 miles a day. They were able to do because of the system that he set up. I found that rather amazing. But then keep in mind, though he's referring to it as the Roman postal system, from what I understand, it was not a public postal system. It was for the use of the emperor to be able to send things out in that fashion. The first public postal service was established in Portugal in 1520 by King Manuel I. And then postal services were set up in many countries. Poland's was in 1558, Norway in 1647, England 1635, established by Charles I. And the way it worked in England, and this map is an 1807 General Post Office letter circulation map for England. But in England, you had the postage was paid by the recipient. So you could write a letter, put an envelope, send it off, and then when they got it, they had to pay to get it. And that's the way it worked. But this expanded both in the UK and throughout the world. Of course, the UK brought in a uniform four-penny post in 1839 and a uniform penny post in 1840, just regulating that's how much it's going to cost. Of course, England also gave us the first postage stamp, introduced in 1840 with two different types you could buy. One was the penny black, as it's called, and the other one was the 2 pence blue. I assume by this point that whoever is sending it is having to pay for it because they have to buy the stamp to put on it. Of course, it's postage stamps that have continued throughout the world. The UK, by the way, is the only nation that does not have the name of the country on the stamp. If these are our current stamps in the UK, and you notice it's just an image of King Charles, as the previous ones were just images of Queen Victoria. But they're the only country in the world to not have the name of the country on their stamps. That's a little bit of stamp trivia. But they didn't have anything like that in the first century. To send letters and correspondence in the Roman Empire, Each trading company had its own staff of letter carriers. This was something that others could take advantage of. Private letters by people who didn't have letter carriers were often allowed to be sent along with the trading company's messages, who are going the same places was their recipients. Although travel wasn't rapid, it was performed easily and it was certain. They could travel by land, they could travel by sea, they could travel vast distances. And people frequently traveled during the early days of the Roman Empire. Uh, Traveled primarily summer months, although some would travel in the winter as well. What's on your screen there is from the first century. That's a Roman tour guide. I have no idea what it's saying, but interesting. But they even had tour guides published in the first century. Tourism was on the go. Now, some of the travel was business related, but some was for education or just curiosity, some to seek employment, some just to be a tourist. That was brought about by the Roman peace that we talked about last week. Ramsay said the sea was covered with ships, interchanging the product of different regions of the earth. Wealth was vastly increased, comfort and well being, hill and valley covered with the dwellings of a growing population. Wars and pirates and robbers had been put an end to. Travel was free and safe. All men could journey where they wished. The most remote and lonely countries were opened up by roads and bridges. It was the simple truth that traveling, whether for business or for pleasure, was contemplated and performed under the empire with an indifference, confidence, and above all, certainty, which were unknown in after centuries until the introduction of steamers and the consequent increase in ease and sureness of communication. So under the Romans, they had good travel. Yes, there were still robbers in certain areas, and the Roman legions would be dispatched there to take care of it. But as a whole, it was safe to travel, and people did travel without any problem. Now, the early Christian writings show that Christians were active in both communication and traveling. And we see this in the book of Acts. This is a map of some of Paul's journeys. Paul's 3 teaching trips through what is now Turkey and on into Asia, the western part of Turkey, into Greece and into Italy, show that travel was not difficult. Yeah, there's certain times a year you didn't travel, because if you did, you might get shipwrecked, as did Paul. But at the end, if you remember, at the end of his second trip, he had stopped by Ephesus, and he was asked to stay on in Ephesus. He declined, but he said he wished to return soon, promised that he would, and did. You see, he could do that because he could be certain he could get to Jerusalem, get to Antioch, and get back to Ephesus without any problem whatsoever. When writing to the Romans, if you remember, he expressed the desire to see them and then journey on to Spain. That's well off on the edge of the map there. Travel was not as difficult as it once had been, and it could be planned with certainty. Letters could be sent with ease, and they supplemented travel in person. Because of letters, Christians were able to stay in touch with each other. By staying in touch, they're able to be bound together in greater love through mutual encouragement. You know, it would have been much easier if Rome had established a regular postal service that anybody could use, but that doesn't seem to have occurred to anybody. Augustus's imperial service continued throughout Roman times, but was strictly confined to official business. It really was a system of special emperor messengers, and developed into a large scale. Christians seized on 2 great facts of the Roman world, though: traveling and letter writing, and used them to maintain contact with each other and to exchange teaching to help everyone grow spiritually, no matter where they were. Letters could be sent without any problem. Because of the Christians, though, a new kind of letter was introduced to the world. Christians developed the letters that were in common usage at the time and used them for new purposes, changed them up a bit. Again, William Ramsey writes, in their hands, communication by letter became one of the most important, if not the most important, of the agencies for consolidating and maintaining the sense of unity among the scattered members of the one universal church. By means of letters, the congregations expressed their mutual affection and sympathy and sense of brotherhood, asked counsel of one another, gave advice with loving freedom and plain speaking to one another, imparted mutual comfort and encouragement, and generally expressed their sense of common life. And this, all that gave rise to a new category of letter. There were two recognized and early, very distinguished categories of letters in the ancient world. One was called the true letter. It would be written by a friend or two friends, but it was really intended only for the person to whom it was addressed. And then there was what they called the literary letter. It was written for public consumption. Sorry, I hit the wrong button there. It's going to go here in a minute. There it goes. Written for public consumption. And it was to be studied as a literary art. And then we find Christian letters, which contain possibly elements of both, but are neither totally personal nor intended to be literary art, although they were written for a wider audience. Christian letters might be addressed to one person, might be addressed to a group of Christians in a location, might be written for all Christians of all ages. They were similar to true letters in that they were from the heart of one Christian to the heart or hearts of other Christians. And I think when we read through Paul's correspondence, we can see a lot of that. They're often written in answer to a question or due to something that was happening in that particular location. But they were for those they initially addressed. In fact, we often find directions for the letter to be read to the entire congregation. In 1 Thessalonians 5:27, Paul writes at the end of it, I call on you solemnly in the Lord to have this letter read to all the brothers and sisters. Although they were written to specific people to address specific situations, they also gave principles of living as a Christian. So they were applicable to a wide range of circumstances. And in that way, they were written for all Christians in all times. Sometimes in the New Testament letters, we find that the letter, although addressed to one specific group, was also for others. Paul's letter to Colossians was also to be read by Christians in Laodicea. At the end of Colossians, he writes, greet the brothers in Laodicea and Nympha and the congregation in her house. When this letter has been read by you, see that it's also read to the Laodicean congregation, that you also read the letter from Laodicea. So we discover that these letters weren't just for the one congregation, they were to be shared. We also discover here that he had written a letter to the Christians in Laodicea, which the Colossian Christians needed to read. We'll talk more about all of Colossae and Laodicea when we get to that letter in our text. White Ramsey says it's evident that the Colossian letter was composed not with an eye to a wider circle, but directly suited to the critical situation in Colossae. The wider application arises out of the essential similarity of human nature in both congregations and in all mankind. The crisis that has occurred in one congregation is likely at the same period to occur in other similar bodies. And the letter which speaks direct to the heart of one man or one body of men will speak directly to the heart of all men in virtue of their common human nature. I think I typed the wrong word there. But that's essentially, it's that essential character of this new type of letter. although written to one person or one group, contained universal principles which all Christians needed. In many ways, it was similar to what's known as the imperial rescript. I couldn't find a photo of it, so I used this Roman inscription, so it doesn't really have anything to do with what I'm talking about. But the imperial rescript were primarily a reply to a request of something specific by one of the emperor's officials. And this came to be regarded as one of the main ways of improving and developing Roman public law. Although it arose out of a specific circumstance, gave the emperor's opinion on it, it was written in a way to set forth a general principle of policy. The letters to the New Testament are similar in that they originated in the circumstances that Christians were living through. I think the letter in Acts 15 is an example of this. At the end of that meeting there in Jerusalem, they composed this letter. The apostles, the elders, and the brothers, to the brothers among the Gentiles in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia, greetings. Since we've heard that some went out from us and disturbed you with words, unsettling your souls, to whom we gave no commandment, it seemed good to us when we came to one mind to select men and send them to you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives for the sake of the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. We therefore have also sent Judas and Silas, who will tell you the same things by word of mouth. So this letter originated because of a specific need in Antioch, in Syria. And they were being unsettled by teachers who seemed to have claimed to have been sent by the apostles. You can read some of that at the beginning of Acts 15. The reply that was given was not only for them, but also for the congregations in Syria and Cilicia, but especially those in Antioch. And this letter is addressed to all of those people that lived in that area. But not only that, it was to be communicated to all the congregations. We go over to Acts chapter 16, we find, talk about Paul and Silas, as they passed through the cities, they delivered the decrees that the apostles and elders in Jerusalem had decided that they should keep. So we have this letter written about a specific incident in a specific place, yet it was to be widely circulated. It just sort of dawned on me while I was talking there. I wonder if it was that short so they could make lots of copies, because they got to take copies with them. So anyway, this was taken with them and given to other congregations. By the way, other examples of this type of letter could be even First Peter, Second Peter, James, First John. Ramsey says, they are informed and inspired with the intense personal affection which the writers felt for every individual of the thousands whom they addressed. They're entirely devoid of the artificiality which is inseparable from the literary epistle. They come straight from the heart, speak straight to the heart, whereas the literary epistle is always and necessarily written with a view to its effect on the public, and the sale is affected and to a certain degree forced and even unnatural. So the letters of Paul are similar to but different than the true letters of the time. The general letters are similar to but different than the literary letters of the time. And even after the first century, Christians continued to send letters. Congregations spoke to each other about important matters and beliefs through correspondence. Individuals also corresponded to individuals and to wider groups. And we have some of that preserved as well. Ramsey wrote, the whole series of such letters is indicative of the strong interest of all individuals in the government of the entire body. They form one of the loftiest and noblest embodiments of a high tone of feeling common to a very large number of ordinary, commonplace, undistinguished human beings. It was this correspondence that helped to bind Christians together in the far-flung reaches of the Roman Empire. Now, there needed to be a way for the letters to be delivered. As we mentioned, there's no post boxes. There's not even any post offices. That means they had to find a courier, a messenger, a person to deliver the correspondence. If you were sending a confidential letter, which contained revealing of your innermost feelings, you needed somebody who's trustworthy to deliver it. And this included being able to trust that it would get to the person you were sending it to. You also had to trust that it wouldn't find its way into somebody else's hands. And you had to trust that the messenger wouldn't tamper with it. Now, large businesses, including Roman government, had slave messengers called tabellari to deliver their messages. Wealthy individuals used some of their own slaves in the same way. For these messengers to be useful, they had to be familiar with the roads and the ways they could travel. What this means is that any business which maintained a large amount of correspondence, which is the only way to communicate to their branches or other businesses, had to, in essence, have their own postal service, their own postal system. The best roads to travel were charted so that a business could know exactly where any messenger was at a given time, due to their knowledge of the land and the roads and the conditions. This means they could roughly know when a letter would arrive, when what it contained would be acted on, and when to expect the messenger to return to be available to deliver more messages. And when you think about that, that's astounding that they could work out all of that without any problem. If they're traveling a long distance, staging posts had been set up where messengers could eat and rest and change transport if that was needed. Now, it probably would be good to mention something about the form letters in the first century took. There's three basic parts of a Roman letter. There was the salutation. That's the beginning, the introduction. And it included both who wrote it and who it was being sent to, and a greeting. Now, Paul in his letters often used a statement of thanksgiving or praise or possibly even a prayer for their well-being. Now, keep in mind, the reason it was this way and you had who wrote it first was they were using scrolls. They were rolled up. You wouldn't have to enroll the entire document to see who'd written it to you. We place our names at the end of a letter. And then there was the body of the letter, which would take up most of the writing. This sometimes would include personal news and reports and other matters. And then the letter had a closing, which might include wishes for the recipient's well-being as well as a prayer. Letters were rarely dated. Now, I was always taught when I was taught to write letters to put the date at the top of the letter. I still find that very useful. If I'm getting a letter that there's a date on it, I know when it was written. Even emails have a date as to when they were sent. I'm noticing more and more people, even businesses, leaving the date off the letters. I've always found it confusing when I get a letter saying you need to respond in so many days. I'm thinking, so many days from what? There's no date on it. And so it always confuses me a bit. But there are even teachers in Roman times that could teach you how to write a good letter. We had them when I was growing up, so I guess it shouldn't surprise us the Romans did. Mark Cartwright wrote, "The Romans, seemingly keen to do just about everything well, also wrote handbooks with sample letters and academic commentaries on how to write good letters, typically when considering the skill of rhetoric." An example being the work of Julius Victor in the 4th century AD. We know, too, from references in letters that the Romans had teachers of letter writing. So proper Roman letter writing was important, and proper Roman letter writing etiquette meant that letters should receive a response. Again, Mark Cartwright said, there also developed the convention that people should reply to letters they had received. And there are several surviving examples of Romans complaining that this did not happen, which could well have been down to the risks of travel and lost letters rather than neglect, because you could not always definitely guarantee it would arrive where it was supposed to. So how does this apply to Christian correspondence? Well, we know from the New Testament writings, as well as what we've preserved from other Christian leaders in the first few centuries, that there was an immense amount of correspondence. Ramsey, in his book on the seven churches, pointed out that from what we have preserved, we can accurately assume that there were multiplied more than what we know about. Sadly, we have no actual preserved information as to how they sent letters or or anything about how that they were delivered from one to the other, except for a few statements, and in particular in Paul's letters. Ramsey says some provision for the safe transmission of that large body of letters, official and private, was obviously necessary. Here's a great subject as to which no information has been preserved. As I mentioned, we do know how some of the New Testament letters were sent and delivered. If you think about Romans, it's thought that possibly Phoebe delivered the letter to the Christians in Rome. Romans 16, first verse, Paul writes, "Now I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea, so that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints and provide her with whatever help she may need from you. For she has been a great help to many, including me." So it seems that she may have been the one that actually took this letter. It's thought that Tychicus delivered the letter to Ephesus. Paul writes at the end of the Ephesian letter, "Tychicus, my dear brother and faithful servant of the Lord, will make everything known to you so that you too may know about my circumstances, how I'm doing. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know our circumstances, that he may encourage your heart." Possibly Zenas and Apollos delivered the letter to Titus. Paul writes to Titus, "Make every effort to help Zenas the lawyer and Apollos on their way. Make sure they have what they need." And of course, it's thought that Onesimus delivered the letter to Philemon, his master, possibly also delivered the letter to the Christians in Colossae. Philemon lived in Colossae, so and they seem to be written in roughly the same time period. So he very well could have delivered them both. In Philemon, verse 10, "I'm appealing to you concerning my child, whose spiritual father I've become during my imprisonment." That is Onesimus, who was formerly useless to you, but is now useful to you and me. I've sent him, who is of my very heart, back to you. And Peter, we know, used Silas to write down his first letter. So sometimes we actually know who actually was the penman. Uh, Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 12. Actually, he wrote in his letter at the end of it, "Through Silvanus," that's another name that is Silas, "whom I know to be a faithful brother, I have written to you briefly in order to encourage you and testify that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it." So he used Silas. Basically the way this worked was the one writing the letter dictated it, and it was written down by somebody else. And these people who wrote them were called, if I can say this right, amanuensis or something like that. It's a Greek word about this phone. But Paul used one. In the Romans, "I, Tertius, who am writing this letter, greet you in the Lord." So he used someone to write down what he said. And although Paul had a habit, and that was to add a personal greeting in his own handwriting at the end. In 2 Thessalonians 3, we see this. "Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times in every way. The Lord be with you all. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand," which is how I write in every letter. "The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all." And the Thessalonian letters are some of the earliest ones of Paul's that we have preserved. So you see, that was his practice, to add this little bit, this personal touch at the end. He writes in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 1, "I, Paul, send this greeting with my own hand." We see it in Galatians 6:11. "See what big letters I make as I write to you with my own hand." And in Colossians 4, "I, Paul, write this greeting by my own hand, remember my chains, grace be with you. And in Philemon. Now, talk about Onesimus, if he's defrauded you of anything or owes you anything, charge what he owes to me. I, Paul, have written this letter with my own hand. So he may have actually written that whole letter himself. I will repay it. I could also mention that you owe me your very self. And so, as there needed to be a courier to deliver the letter, had people that helped write it need to be couriers to deliver it, it's thought that they would have used Christians. And this is what we see in the New Testament letters. Christian couriers would need some place to stay on their travels and probably wouldn't use the pagan inns. The pagan inns were known for, as Ramsay put it, the worst character in respect of morality and comfort and cleanliness. Not a nice place to stay. So they'd be housed and fed by Christians in the town where they ended up spending the night. And there were numerous admonitions in the New Testament letters about providing hospitality for traveling Christians. Remember Paul's instructions to Titus about Zenas and Apollos, that he was to help them on their way. We find this in Hebrew. Hebrews talks about this. Brother love must continue. Do not neglect hospitality, because through it some have entertained angels without knowing it. It seems that the letters would have been taken when once delivered to the leader of a congregation, who would then have it read out loud when the entire group assembled. This seems to be what we have in the letters to the 7 congregations in Revelation. Each letter begins the same way. Write to the messenger of the congregation in Ephesus, Laodicea, Philadelphia, whichever of the 7 towns. Now, we noted in our first lesson that the Greek word here is the word angelos, from which we get our English word angel. That's what most English translations have there. The vast majority use that for it. But the Greek word does not mean a heavenly being. It simply means a messenger. And McCord properly translated it, right to the messenger of the congregation. It would seem that these letters were written to be given to a messenger or messengers going to a group of Christians in a particular city. Although we've already noted that there was a logical circular route that a messenger could have taken. So it could have been there was a group of messengers, and each had a message. They traveled together, one for each congregation. But the messengers are the ones that this is initially given to, so it can go to the congregations. And we'll pick this back up next week by looking at the 7 congregations in Asia. And then the following week we'll begin going through each letter. So I'm hoping that was in some way useful. I found it very useful as I studied through this to learn more about how letters were put together and delivered, and how all this took place in the 1st century, and to discover that tourism was something that was already happening then. After the Roman times, it fell off until just a few privileged people. But during Romans times, apparently it was fairly common. And we read throughout the book of Acts, we see a lot of travel going on. And then we also see the letters being written as well.